I'm Simon Wilson, and I'm looking at how innovation in spectrum management through the introduction of secure dynamic spectrum access could increase the amount of spectrum available to MNOs as a supplement to their licensed spectrum. And if conference support are able to display my slides, that would be great.
Just bringing the slides up now.
Thank you very much. And on to slide 2, I'll carry on. My motivation is driven by my background in spectrum management, and in particular a mobile network operator's perspective. In theory, DSA systems should improve the technical efficiency of spectrum usage, but does this lead to overall economic benefit? I'm very pleased to share with you today an overview of my research and my initial findings. And we're on to slide 3 when you get a chance, please. The process of characterizing and assessing the potential availability of DSA spectrum could follow the same methodology regardless of spectrum band or geography. Firstly, we need to, we're on slide 3, thank you. Firstly, we need to identify the primary users, for example, in the case of the UK by using Ofcom's wireless telegraphy register, then define their required protection ratios. And at this point, we need to consider the range of potential secondary user deployment options, and in my case, that MNOs may have when seeking supplemental access to spectrum. In my studies, I've examined a range of power and bandwidth options with a focus on deployment of low to medium power small cells. Through Monte Carlo simulation, we then need to determine any and all exclusion zones. This is in the frequency, the geography, and the time domains. And finally, if the proposed deployment promises a viable return on investment for secondary users, whilst obviously protecting the incumbent primary users, then I believe that regulators should enable DSA. Next slide, please. So as an example, I've defined a target market of Greater London and investigated the addressable spectrum opportunity in the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz band. The current shared spectrum licenses in the UK have a 100 megahertz bandwidth, and this means that they address just 23% of the total opportunity in this band. This is measured in megahertz pops, and of course, this is due mainly to the limited secondary user bandwidth allowed. If we were to allow secondary users access to the full 400 megahertz, the availability increases, of course, but only to 31%. And in this case, deployment is limited primarily by co-channel interference. Next slide, please. If we reduce the bandwidth authorized to avoid co-channel interference, we should be on slide 5 now, we find that the addressable market increases significantly to 55%. And if we were to reduce the bandwidth further to remove the effects of secondary users' out-of-band emissions, the overall addressable opportunity reduces as expected, but the pops per megahertz increases. This is an intriguing result that demands further thought about the implications in terms of the overall spectrum efficiency. Next slide, please. Over the coming months, I'll be looking further at the trade-off between bandwidth, power levels, and addressable market in terms of investment costs and returns. I expect to be able to identify and recommend an optimal operating point, although I do recognise that this may only apply to the particular sharing scenarios modelled. For example, UK use of the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz band in my first example. Nevertheless, as we see from the initial value calculation of optimal spectrum use in this example, even a case-by-case approach might unlock tens of millions of pounds of value to the economy. In summary, it seems to me that when enabling DSA from a regulatory perspective in the UK, there is a definite need to increase the maximum allowable bandwidth from the 100 megahertz currently licensed. And from a research, technology and standards point of view, We should also be looking to increase C-band carrier aggregation from the current 300 megahertz in 3GPP up to 800 megahertz. And this would enable the full 3.4 to 4.2 gigahertz band to be addressed. I haven't had time to share all of my initial results with you this morning, but it also appears to me that the current UK shared access power limits may be appealing enough to MNOs in a DSA model, but we only will optimize spectrum usage if the DSA algorithms adopted dynamically vary the secondary user power allocation based on the number and location of secondary users. Next slide, please. I'd be very happy to answer any quick questions that you may have now, or join us in the virtual meeting room at lunchtime, or please drop me a line and we can carry on the conversation at a later time. Thanks for listening.